To get a sense of where the pandemic goes from here in terms of the health emergency that China is dealing with and what this could mean for the rest of the world, and also how the current situation in China could potentially prove to be a boon for India, I'm joined at the World Economic Forum here in Davos by two special guests. Adar Poonawalla from the Serum Institute and Narendran from Tata Steel. Two very different sectors but joined by the thread of what could happen to India in manufacturing and health from here. Adar, welcome, and I want to start by asking you about what's happening inside China, the manner in which the pandemic is spreading, and then we'll come in a moment to what that could mean for India. But give us your sense of what's happening inside China.
Great to be here with you, Rahul. You know, a lot of people here from different parts of the world have been concerned about China. And of course, being our close neighbors, we're watching how the situation unravels. India, because of its excellent vaccine coverage and the herd immunity, because we allowed infections to spread like other countries and didn't have a zero COVID policy after the initial lockdowns, India, along with other countries, are in a far better situation. Do I fear, this sort of thing happening in India again, like what's happening in China? I don't think so, because, as I mentioned, our vaccine has been very effective and the coverage has been very effective. China, sadly, has not had both of those situations pan out, and we just pray and hope that they solve their issue. In fact, I was talking to some people to try and offer the Western vaccines and Indian vaccines to them as boosters, so they can control their hospitalizations and come out of even spreading the infection.
Are the Chinese interested in your vaccine?
I've requested them to put political issues aside and just look at the bigger picture, because, for the world, it's important that China comes back also. And we just wish them the best in a speedy recovery, because if you look at supply chain disruptions, investments, uncertainty, people are still a little uncertain to make investments in this part of the world because of what's happening there. But of course, given that you've seen the response here, India is definitely by far the most reliable and chosen destination for investors. And given the choice, of course, India stands far ahead.
The fear really is about the prospect of a new mutation which emerges from the widespread COVID virus through the mainland right now, right? How real is that fear that there could be a new mutation which your current vaccines don't cover?
Well, there are already these mutations, like you've seen the one in China, and you've got Omicron variants and subvariants. The good news is that, of course, it's not that severe. It's much milder than Delta. And you're absolutely right, the old traditional vaccines don't work so well against these variants. The silver lining is, in about 10 days, we should be approved by the Drug Controller of India for the Novavax vaccine as a booster. And here we've got data that it's very effective against Omicron and all these variants. So if people want to take boosters, the choice is available to take it once a year or whatever.
What's your current recommendation in terms of boosters? If I took my last vaccine, say in February, March last year, do I need a booster?
Absolutely. I think if you're traveling and you're very social and interacting with people, which we all are, I think you should look at a booster. This booster has been proven and will be approved as a heterologous booster, which means it can be taken as a booster despite whichever vaccine you may have taken in the past, Covishield, Covaxin, anything.
The conspiracy theory is Adar is saying this because it's good for the pharma business and for his pocket.
No, this is a response to a question. If someone asks that, what do I do, should I take a booster or not? Now, if you're a healthy individual, you generally don't take a flu shot, every year, then don't take it. But if you feel that you're traveling a lot, especially to Asia and Southeast Asia, then you absolutely should take it, as a booster to protect against these new variants.
Mr. Narendran, I started by asking Adar about what's happening in China, because what's happening in China from a health emergency perspective also is potentially one of the biggest opportunities for India as global companies realign their supply chains. To what extent do you think at this moment, in the way things are, is India being able to benefit from the idea that companies need to look beyond China in this China plus one strategy of theirs?
I think that's playing out quite favorably for India, because the aftershocks of not what just happened in China, but also what's happened in Ukraine and Russia, has made organizations, global companies look at de-risking supply chains. It's no longer about cost optimization, but about resilience, managing risks, etc. So when they're looking at another place beyond China, obviously there are other contenders. But India is special because India is not just a source, it can also be a market. And with the PLI schemes and the government trying to do more to attract investments, there is certainly a strong case for investments to come into India, which you've seen in electronics and traditionally areas where we've not seen so much of investments. So I think it's a good
But
time
is
for
India likely to be one of the beneficiaries along with, say, Vietnam, Indonesia, some other countries? Or do you see India as being the prime beneficiary because companies are now desperate to move part of their supply chains out of China?
You know, the de-risking of supply chains actually started maybe a few years back. It got triggered first with Fukushima because that disrupted a lot of supply chains. At that time, when people were looking at a choice beyond China, most people went to Vietnam actually. Textile industry went to Bangladesh. I think India lost out in that wave. I think at this time, India is being positioned better. I think the policies are more favorable for investments. The Indian market is also showing a lot more potential and promise. So I think now it seems to be that the stars are aligned in favor of India. It's for us to mess it up. But having said that, I think while at the central level we're doing a lot of work, finally the investments happen at the states. So a lot depends on how the states also deal with this opportunity. I'm happy to see a lot of states here trying to market themselves. But I think ultimately investors will look at the experience that they have and they really come and put money on the ground.
Do you see India Inc. investing in the India story, given that capacity utilization has been in the mid-70s for a long time? Tata Steel has announced big capital expenditure plans, but a lot of India Inc. still holding back. Do you see that change, or do you think global turbulence will mean that companies would like to stay on the fence for a little longer?
So if you're an export-driven company, then obviously you would look at what's happening globally. But if you're primarily dependent on Indian demand, like a lot of the steel industry is, then you would invest because with the government focus on infrastructure, India is seeing infrastructure-led growth, investment-led growth. Traditionally, it's been consumption-led growth. So that's making it better. But if you really look at private sector investment 10 years back, the three big sectors were steel, power, and chemicals. Power is pretty much gone out because those were thermal power plants, coal-based power plants. Now it's more renewables. But I think steel and chemicals is coming back. Steel has certainly come back. Last 6 months we had a problem. But otherwise, steel is certainly coming back on track for investments. I see a lot of investments in supply chains, for instance, warehousing, supply chains, and electronics manufacturing.
Do you think production-linked incentive schemes have reached a level where a lot of global companies want to invest in India beyond just a token investment, where India actually becomes a critical part of their global supply chains?
I think so. Again, electronics manufacturing is a case in point. We hardly had any...
But that's also because India is a big market for those
right.
electronics.
But if you see what's happening in cell phones, India was one of the biggest importers. Now India is becoming one of the big exporters. I wouldn't say biggest. I think in India, any new investor will struggle initially. But once you've got the scale, you've got the momentum going, I think you learn to deal with the challenges that is India. And I see it even in steel. It's so much difficult to build a greenfield plant. But once you've got the land and got started, it's much easier to expand. So I think a lot of these manufacturing units will see that happen. Ecosystems are coming up now around it. So I think the momentum is there.
Adar, the pandemic was, in some senses, a test case for the future of vaccine companies. On the one side, you had the more fancy mRNA vaccine companies like Moderna, which got off to a very flashy start, and then there were the more perceivably stodgy old world vaccine companies. Do you think old is coming to be gold in the way that those mRNA companies haven't really been fully able to live up to their promise?
No, absolutely. I think it's the vaccine companies that have stood the test of time and experience in dealing with large-scale manufacturing that have really come out of this pandemic and will continue, making vaccines. There are going to be new investments, fresh investments being made. I think, we would have to wait another 5 to 6 years to see how well some of these new companies in South Korea, United States, and other places who have traditionally not made vaccines at high scale. It's all about scale. There are many vaccine companies today who can make 50 million doses, 100 million doses. But when you go into billions of doses, that's when you separate the boys from the men. And I think it is important to have large vaccine capacity all over the world, because we saw what happened in a pandemic, and I don't imagine that happening again, because quite simply everyone has increased their capacity. So, for example, we've now got a 4 billion dose capacity, of which 3 billion doses are idle almost. So God forbid there is another pandemic, we could vaccinate our entire nation in a matter of 3 months and service other continents at the same time. And other Indian companies have also scaled up. So India has now, from pre-pandemic times, probably 2.5 times the vaccine capacity that it did before the pandemic, if combined, which is close to 8 to 10 billion now, which is more than enough vaccines, to protect India, Africa, maybe South America. And
You mentioned Africa. The Indian pharma sector came in for a lot of brickbats when in Ghana and in Kazakhstan, young kids apparently died while investigations are still on, but the charges that they died because they consumed cough syrup made by Indian companies. How much of a hit has that been for the pharma sector?
Well, look, I mean, Indian pharmaceutical and vaccine companies have demonstrated tremendous quality, far better than China, South Korea, and all these other countries. We're, for example, registered in the US and Europe. We supplied vaccines to those nations. We're US FDA approved. There may be some isolated situations, and as you said, investigations are on, so who are we to comment on really what happened? Was there really a fault of a manufacturer or not? And these things are easily correctable, but more or less, if you look at look at Sun Pharma, Dr. Reddy's, Cipla, all the major pharmaceutical companies, they've never had.
But you accept that incidents like this shake people's faith
temporarily. It's
in
very
the
temporary.
Indian pharma sector?
No, it's temporary. And look, globally, it doesn't suit the global narrative, especially when we're talking about sending vaccines to the US and other developed nations. They naturally want to keep the competition out. So they'll politicize it, they'll polarize it and exaggerate the situation. Of course, that doesn't mean that we need to overlook any quality standards and all that. There are regular inspections which happen from the WHO, US FDA, Europe, and all of that. And they've, I don't know which company you're talking about, but generally all these other companies, including mine, go through a very stringent inspection process. For example, we've got a 12-day inspection coming from the World Health Organization in Geneva coming up in February. So, we are adhering to the highest standards.
Mr. Narendran, there's a lot of talk here in Davos about the prospects of a global recession. 70% of the economists who were surveyed in the WEF study said they anticipate a recession this year. How is that impacting the steel sector in general?
So if you look at the steel sector, I think the most fragile geography is Europe. Europe is struggling with the war. Europe is struggling with high inflation, not much of consumption growth. So if you have growth, you can manage, let's say, rising wages, over larger volumes. So there's a struggle in Europe. I'm quite confident that the US, as always, will bounce back quite well. The surprise story has been Japan. Japan has been doing quite well. And if China comes out of this, India is strong, Middle East is strong. There are many parts of Africa which are doing well. So honestly, I think, yes, the developed world is probably going to struggle a little bit, particularly Europe. But I think the emerging economies are showing a lot more promise. And if China bounces back even a little bit, I think that will have a huge impact, because a lot of Southeast Asia depends on the health of the Chinese economy.
But the question is the Chinese bounce back, it is sharp, but is it short? Or could it be more sustained? Or do you think because they've been shut for so long, which is why you're seeing a bounce, but it's essentially the bounce of a dead frog?
So in China, if you really look at, in the context of steel consuming sectors, auto has been quite strong. They still produce and sell 2.5 million cars a month, right? I mean, that's a scale at which they're still operating. It had dropped down to half that level maybe 2 years back. It's back. Construction is what has struggled because of the financing of some of the companies. But now they're rolling out a lot of incentives, and we see the property markets coming back. If you look at commodity prices in China, copper, steel, it's all gone up hugely in the last 4 weeks. To take your point, I don't think you're going to see a rapid increase like we saw, maybe a year back. It will stabilize to levels which are more sustainable. The other thing to be kept in mind for a lot in industry is, if you look at the steel industry, most people were losing money over the last 6 months because people have underinvested in coal, for instance, and coal prices have stayed up. and that's 40% of the input cost for a steel company. So there are cost pressures which are also helping keep the prices at a certain level. So I think a mix of these, we will not see the kind of steep increases we saw last year, but we'll see prices operating at more stable levels, sustainable levels.
Adar, when it comes to risks, there are two views on health risks. One is that the pandemic that we just went through is a once-in-a-century phenomena, and it happened with the Spanish influenza, and now we're kind of done with it. The other is, because of climate change and the way that the world is shaping, pandemics are just here to stay. There could be another health crisis. You never know where from. It could be as bad. It could potentially be worse. Given that you're the center of what's happening, what's your take on this?
Well, we're definitely better prepared for the next pandemic, God forbid it comes. I mean, look at the testing infrastructure that we have, the investments we've made in health systems globally, I'm saying, including India. So God forbid there is another attack like this, we will be better prepared and can get ahead of it. There is better vaccine capacity, pharmaceutical drug capacity. But look, there is one thing that we need to resolve. And I'm so happy that the WHO pandemic accords are now taking some shape. You know, I talked earlier about having a global treaty where vaccine, raw material, drug sharing, global harmonization of regulatory standards, if they could happen, countries need not then bicker and have political arguments in situations where they don't share resources, technology and all of that. If that takes place, we'll be in a far better shape. Now, my take on what's probably going to happen is that we will see isolated outbreaks in different parts of the world. Take, for example, in Uganda, there was one of Ebola recently. We fulfilled the 90-day mission of making a vaccine for clinical trials and shipped it out to Uganda. By the time we shipped it out, the outbreak was already over. So now we have to find and wait till, well, God forbid, any other cases to come, and then you can test out the vaccine in a trial. But you see the way and speed at which now a solution can be developed with CEPI and Gavi and WHO and companies working together is a different
TV is not
situation.
saying anything. His eyes are essentially saying, well, I hope it never comes down.
Yeah.
We don't
Well,
want
I
to
hope
be,
so too.
We don't want to be
Absolutely,
through
absolutely.
one of those. TV Narendran, Poonawalla, thank you so much for your time. Wish